American lives, almost as many American lives, I should say, as the 9/11 attacks. Almost 3,000 people died on that island in this storm, one storm. So now we know that that is what the official death toll is going with. Other reports have said the number could actually be closer to 5,000. Nonetheless, we're dealing with this 2,975 number at this point. How did we get there? Well, let's start with one of the most obvious, but it's not one that gets much play. You had credit agencies, bond agencies, major banks here in the United States that basically screwed over Puerto Rico for years. There is massive ongoing litigation over what those big banks did, essentially stealing money that Puerto Rican citizens had put into bonds there on the island, investing in their own government, so to speak, with these bonds. But the big banks ripped them off, stole the money, left them with nothing, and left Puerto Rico with nothing to help build up their infrastructure. That's one of the reasons there was so much damage from it. There was no money. The money was all with the big banks who swindled them. If you haven't had the opportunity to look at some of the litigations and some of the allegations that have come out of that, I do suggest you take the time to look into it a little bit. Santander is one of the banks involved in this. It's absolutely disgusting what they did to the people there. Second, we have the pitiful response from FEMA. When you look at Hurricane Harvey, it took less than, I think, 4 to 6 days, and you had 73 different helicopters coming in and out with supplies, rescuing people, doing things like that. At Puerto Rico, it took several weeks before we had helicopters down there offering aid, evacuating people, bringing supplies. Weeks to get there to do this. It's almost like everybody forgot Puerto Rico existed, or more importantly, forgot that they were American citizens, or more importantly than that, forgot that they were human beings. Because everybody likes to say, like, let's not forget they're American citizens, we got to take care of them. Yes, that's true. But they're also human beings, so we should take care of them. Nationality doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. Language doesn't matter. Human beings are suffering. We should help them. That's a message that I think too few people in this country, especially those on the right, seem to understand. But aside from just saying, well, people are suffering, we should help them, yes, as a country, we had a responsibility, a legal obligation to go and help them. FEMA dropped the ball here. FEMA was late getting down there. They were horrible in getting out supplies. They underestimated how much they needed to help the people on the island. And this is actually from an internal FEMA report, by the way. This isn't just an assessment I'm giving. FEMA admitted this. They said they were about 5,000 employees short to even be able to properly respond to last year's hurricane season. They also admit that they've been grossly underfunded thanks to Republican budget cuts. And that's what happens. When Republicans go out there and talk about, we got to shrink the government, we got to cut their budgets, they're bloated, they're overgrown. This is what you get. You get a situation like Puerto Rico, where our agencies that are tasked with going down there and helping people and saving people and making sure everything is okay and put back together, they can't do their jobs because they don't have the funding to do it as a federal agency. You also had National Guard down there. And as I mentioned on yesterday's program, they left tractor trailers full of supplies sitting on the island's election headquarters in their parking lot. And they just left them. New York Times report from a week or two ago said that these supplies were left in there. Nobody was told what to do. Nobody was told how to distribute, so nobody distributed them. Before they left, the National Guard were the ones handing this stuff out. But when it was time to pack up and leave, they didn't bother to tell anybody what to do with it. So it just sat there and it rotted in those trailers. There's plenty of blame to go around, but at the end of the day, when nearly 3,000 American citizens die on your watch, this whole atrocity falls at the feet of the President of the United States. We all remember the massive backlash across the country to George Bush's pitiful response to Hurricane Katrina. And yet there is almost complete silence coming from the public demanding some kind of accountability for Trump's dismal response to Puerto Rico. Not that we would get anything from him. I mean, let's be honest. This man knows exactly what he did. He did it on purpose. He did it because he doesn't care. In other news, and this is an equally disgusting story, 16 states here in the U.S. have joined a brief, an amicus brief, filed with the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that their states, the employers in their states, should be allowed to fire people if they're LGBTQ. 16 different states, their attorneys general, are writing the Supreme Court, because of a case the court may or may not take up, saying that we also want to be able and think it should be perfectly legal, and it's certainly not against the Civil Rights Act, to fire somebody simply for being LGBTQ. And their argument is that because sex in the Civil Rights Act of 64, they're trying to argue that that only refers to your sex at birth. It doesn't include sexual orientation. It doesn't include, any kind of transgendered, nothing. Just what you are at birth, and it doesn't go any further beyond that at all whatsoever. They want to take us back in time, and essentially criminalize homosexuality. Any member of the LGBTQ community would be able to be fired from their employer just because of who they are as a person. That's what these states want. Here are the states: Alabama, Arkansas, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Mississippi, Nebraska, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Every one of those states wants to be able to fire people just for who they are. We have to take a break. We'll be right back.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show is audience-supported media. I really mean that, not just a catchphrase. And much of that support is small contributions on Patreon, contributions as small as $1 per month, meaning just cents for each hour-long episode of the show. Plus, patrons can also get the daily bonus show and the daily commercial-free TV show by pledging at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. We've rolled out great new perks on Patreon, including free bumper stickers, t-shirts, coffee mugs, and more at different giving levels, as well as exclusive content. And it all comes with the pleasure of knowing you're supporting independent progressive media, an alternative to the corporate stuff that is as much a part of the problem as our political system. If you value the show and have as little as $1 to put towards independent media, check out patreon.com/David Pakman Show and make a pledge today. It'll feel good, and I'd really appreciate it. Patreon.com/David Pakman Show. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/David Pakman Show and on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And if you want to reach me directly, no trolling allowed, follow me on Twitter at dpakman. Hope to hear from you soon.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I'm Farron Cousins from Ring of Fire, sitting in for David Pakman today. I started today's show by talking about the state of Florida and the primary victories down there, and Andrew Gillum and Sean Shaw and how great that is. But there's also a lot of horrible right now in the state of Florida. And some of it does go back to that primary. Rick Scott, our current Republican governor, did win the primary on the Republican side. So he is now our Republican nominee for Senate. He is going up against Democratic incumbent Bill Nelson. And believe it or not, one of the biggest issues that these two men will be fighting about in this election coming up, something they've been fighting about for a couple months now, is toxic algae. This story hasn't gotten a ton of national attention. Toxic algae is not exactly a sexy thing that's going to get a ton of clicks or a ton of viewers. but it's a very real issue down here in the state of Florida. Here's what happens, and it's kind of a complicated thing, so I'm going to explain it as simply as possible. Massive lake down in South Florida, Lake Okeechobee. You've probably heard of it. Every year during the rainy season, levels of the lake get too high, so the state comes in and drains the water, 2 separate lakes, one on each side, one going to the Gulf of Mexico, one going to the Atlantic Ocean. That keeps the lake levels down. What also comes into the lake, in addition to the rainwater, is toxic discharge from sugar mills. See, South Florida, and this is something most people don't know, they don't even think about it. We still have those sugar barons down here in Florida. They control a lot of the politics. They throw around millions upon millions of dollars, and their factories release toxic discharges, and they go directly into Lake Okeechobee. And when you get that sugary toxic discharge, it creates toxic algae. And that's what happens. So when this toxic algae begins blooming in Lake Okeechobee, and then it is funneled out through those lakes to the Gulf and the Atlantic, you end up with toxic algae all along our shorelines, which is what's happening now. Except for this year, that toxic algae met up with a red tide. So we now have this massive combination of red tide and toxic algae that have married together and created this massive amount of toxicity all along Florida's coastlines. If you're not familiar with the state of Florida, you need to understand that our coastlines are our #1 source of revenue as a state. Tourism is the biggest industry here in the state. And yeah, we've got Disney World and Universal and all that. That accounts for a lot. But most people are actually going to the beaches. They're coming for the nice weather. Now they can't do that. Tourism industry is losing a ton of money because of these toxic algae blooms. Property values along the coastline are plummeting, and people are getting sick from doing nothing more than standing on the beach and breathing. Breathing is getting people sick in Florida because of this toxic algae discharge. So there's the backstory. That's why the algae is here. That's how it got so bad. Oh, and by the way, this is worth mentioning. Those 2 lakes where we funnel all that water out of Lake Okeechobee, there's no life in it. There's no fish. There's no other animals. They're so toxic because of the discharge each year, nothing can live in them. If you took a fish and put it in that river, it would die. So that's how toxic that is. So anyway, bringing it back to the campaign, for several months now, Bill Nelson and Rick Scott have been arguing back and forth about who's to blame, because Bill Nelson takes a lot of money from the sugar barons. The sugar barons are the ones who are creating this toxicity, which breeds the algae. Bad on Nelson. But recently, major story came out talking about how Rick Scott, as governor of Florida, cut $700 million from the budget of state environmental agencies that are actually in charge of monitoring and handling the toxic algae outbreaks. So yes, while it is bad that Nelson is taking money from the people who are creating the problem, Rick Scott took money away from the people who are supposed to fix the problem. $700 million. So Rick Scott stripped away more money than Bill Nelson took from his sugar buddies. And the sugar people are also funding Republicans. They've given money to Rick Scott, so that's also kind of a wash there. So if you had to put a blame percentage on this, you could probably easily throw around about 90% on Rick Scott, if not more, maybe 10% on Bill Nelson. But here's the kicker. Rick Scott, as the 2-term governor of the state of Florida, who's hitting the end of his term-limited time here, he's cutting money from environmental protection here in the state of Florida, a state that is 100% dependent upon environmental tourism. And he thinks we don't need to protect this. So can you imagine the kind of damage this man would do in the U.S. Senate? Because at that point, he doesn't just get to make rules for Florida. No, he gets to influence rules for everybody. So any area dependent upon having a clean environment is at risk if Rick Scott goes to the Senate. There is a lot riding on this Senate race down here in the state of Florida. And though I am not a huge Bill Nelson fan, I will tell you that he is 1,000 times better than Rick Scott, who, by the way, happens to be a guy who committed one of the largest Medicaid, Medicare frauds in the history of the federal government, more than $1 billion, only managed to keep himself out of prison by pleading the Fifth Amendment more than 70 times during depositions. It's bad enough that we had him as our governor for 2 terms because the people down here don't really vote in the right way, but it would be even worse to send him to the U.S. Senate where he would team up with Marco Rubio, and God only knows what kind of damage those 2 guys would inflict. While we're on the subject of the environment, massive story. Probably one of the most important stories in this country. Monsanto's Roundup. The active ingredient in Roundup, glyphosate, has been linked by independent study after independent study to all kinds of forms of cancer, kidney diseases, liver diseases, neurological diseases, birth defects, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In fact, the recent trial that just concluded where the jury awarded the plaintiff, I think it was $209 million after they determined that his non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was linked to his exposure to Roundup as a school groundskeeper. $289 million. The jury determined that Monsanto covered up these dangers. They knew about them and all of that. So that's what's happening with that. Monsanto is currently facing thousands of lawsuits over people who say that they have been injured, developed cancer or other illnesses from exposure to glyphosate in Roundup. I'm telling you that to tell you this. According to recent studies, and these studies, believe it or not, have actually been coming out since, I believe, January of this year, glyphosate is now being found in some of the most popular foods in this country. The latest study came from the Environmental Working Group, where they found that there were unsafe levels of glyphosate in pretty much every oat or wheat-based breakfast product here in the United States, including blockbuster sellers like Cheerios, granola bars, baby formula. In case you're not aware of the entire Monsanto story, this is a story I love to tell. It's one I know very well. I have helped with Mike Papantonio, who is handling these lawsuits. And I want everybody to understand just how deceitful Monsanto truly is in terms of covering up for their glyphosate. This is a product that pulls in about $4 billion a year, just Roundup from Monsanto. They have known for decades now, internal studies going back to at least the 80s, if not before that, showing that, yeah, Roundup, glyphosate, in lab animals, they were developing tumors. They were getting cancers. They were having kidney failure. So in the early 90s, the EPA comes out and says, okay, Monsanto, we're going to have to go ahead and list glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. And they did that. It was listed as such for a few years. But then the lobbying from Monsanto eventually convinced the EPA to drop that probable or possible human carcinogen. So then a few years ago, when the International Agency for Research on Cancer with the World Health Organization ruled that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen, Monsanto began attacking the World Health Organization. They got Republicans actually earlier this year to threaten to cut funding to the World Health Organization if they didn't declassify glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. Monsanto created front groups, the Glyphosate Task Force, to go out there and tell us just how safe glyphosate is. Hell, it's almost safe enough so you could just drink a glass of it. Of course, when offered to do so in several documentaries, nobody from Monsanto was actually willing to do that. They got online, they hired paid trolls to go after anyone online who dare say something negative about Roundup and how dangerous it is. Yet every independent study, ones not funded by Monsanto, has shown that, yeah, this stuff is going to cause massive health problems that could lead to death when this stuff gets in human beings. Roundup is so potent that if you get a drop on your skin, it is detectable in your urine stream within 30 minutes. This stuff is toxic. And here's the problem. This is why these studies showing that it's in all of our foods are so important. The reason GMOs even exist is because they were created by Monsanto in order to create crops that were resistant to Roundup being sprayed on them. And now that we have these GMOs, the GMO wheat, oats, all kinds of things like that, grains basically, we can go out there, we can just hose them down with Roundup to kill all the weeds and it won't hurt the plants at all. But that Roundup is on the plants, it's on the produce. So when you take that and then you make a food product out of it, you make a bread, you make a cereal, you make baby formula or baby food, you make beer and wine, which is also now contaminated with glyphosate. Most popular brands in the country contaminated with glyphosate. It's everywhere because this produce that is being sprayed with glyphosate is basically the basis of our food chain here in the United States. They feed it to livestock. So you go out, say, I'm not going to have grains. It's contaminated with glyphosate. Give me a steak. What do you think the cow's been eating? I'm going to have some nice bacon. What do you think the pig's been eating? This stuff is everywhere. It's in all our food. It's in our bodies right now. And chances are, if you've had anything to eat today, you've ingested some of Monsanto's glyphosate poison. And on that incredibly depressing note, we're going to wrap things up for today. Coming up on today's bonus show, though, got some great stuff. A Republican congressman is blaming his corruption on climate change. Got that and much more, but I want to thank David very much for letting me sit in. If you want more from me, you can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/theringofFire. You can follow me on Twitter at Farron Balanced. That's FARRON BALANCED. It's the same on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to follow me there, that's where I am. Thanks again to David and his entire staff. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Have a great evening.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Good evening. I'm Maya Hasegawa, and it's 7:02, and I'm calling the meeting of the Development Review Board to order. For those of you who are first-timers, I have some opening remarks. If you've heard them before, you can kind of
tune out.
Yeah, until you have to swear your oath. At the DRB, we hear applications for land development in the town of Brattleboro and appeals of zoning administrator decisions. Procedurally, the Development Review Board operates on the record. Broadly, this means that we take a clear record of testimony from the applicant and any interested parties, and then issue a written decision with our findings. Applicants and members of the public should be aware that as we are on the record, this is your opportunity to comment on and provide evidence relating to the application. In the event our decision is appealed to the environmental court, the court will not take or consider additional testimony at its hearing, but will look at the evidence from our hearings, the regulations, and determine if the evidence supports the findings and decision of this board. That's why we're being recorded, and you have to speak into the mic if you make comments. Only interested persons that participate in this proceeding may appeal a decision made by the board, so I strongly urge all of you to speak up at this hearing. As we are on the record, I'm going to ask that you affirm your testimony will be truthful. So will the applicants and anyone wishing to speak, or if you even think you might speak, stand and raise your right hand.
You might speak, stand. You might speak, stand.
You will have to. You have to.
Do something?
Are you going to speak?
I know, just,
Are you going to speak at the
are you
hearing?
gonna speak tonight?
I don't know.
Well, if you, even if you're not sure, stand and raise your right hand. I hereby affirm that the evidence I give in the cause under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth, under the pains and penalties of perjury. Say, I do. Thank you. Applicants require a majority of the full board to succeed. That is 4 votes out of 7. So we have 5 people here tonight. You need to get 4 votes out of 5. If we don't, because we don't have a full board, we'll consider a request to continue your application to the next public meeting, which will be the 17th of September. We also have one person who has agreed to watch the proceedings on television and call in his vote. And we probably have another person that would do the same.
Yep.
So you can start giving your presentation, and if it looks like you had the votes might go against you, you can ask for a continuance. Okay. After taking testimony, the board will close the public hearing and may vote on your application. The board will issue a written decision within 45 days of the close of the hearing. While we may vote on an application, it is the written decision that controls the timeline for appeal. It should be noted that the town of Brattleboro is a party with an interest in land development applications. The town does not have a special status before this board, and documents provided to the board by the town planning department, town attorney, or other town departments will be considered in exactly the same way as information from the applicant and all other interested parties. Okay. So And I have a motion to approve the minutes.
I move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Abstain.
Abstain.
You're abstaining.
Yeah.
No. I'm.
Oh, Dave is
Yeah,
abstaining.
I wasn't.
I'll vote yes. So that's 4. 1 abstain. Okay. Brian, has the meeting been properly warned?
Yes, it has.
Are there any conflicts of interest from anybody on the board?
The only thing I can say is on 2018-98, I'm on the Board of Listers, and we saw this before for tax exemption in June. Was that right? Yeah, early June, so, but I have no conflict.
No ex parte communications about?
No.
Okay. David, you're appointed to hear everything? Okay, the first thing on the agenda is 2018-103 Insight Photography Project. And if you recall, that was the blade sign from last month. And the applicant has withdrawn the request for approval and is going to submit a modified design for administrative approval.
Oh, okay.
So we don't have to deal with the square footage or the blade sign.
Goody.
No math, Kathy.
That's great.
Okay. The next item on the agenda is 2018-98 Vermont River Conservancy Waterfront District. Yeah. Do you need something to?
Get one of those.
We have an
stands.
easel.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't bring one, sir.
Which one is the easel? Yeah. Look like screens. That would
Did you want some poster boards to put that up? Yeah, sorry, I didn't. Yeah, let me go back.
Alright. This may be a little wonky. Sure how it locks in, perhaps.
I don't think that works.
Yeah, I think you're just gonna be using one of these,
Yeah, I can.
whichever. We can put it at the highest level though. That might make sense. It's partly for us and partly for the camera people.
Brian, I'll be right back with
Yeah.
the poster board. So.
Can I introduce myself and
Yes.
start? Okay.
Yep.
My name is Steve Libby. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont River Conservancy. This is a project that began with a study of post-Irene economic impacts on downtown Brattleboro called the VERY study, which you may or may not be familiar with. But it's basically a study to look at what were the priority projects that could be taken on to reduce flood vulnerability in downtown Brattleboro. And this particular property, it's officially known as 250 Bird Street. It was the Sosasimo Lumber Company storage yard off of William Street. And we were asked by the Brattleboro Conservation Commission and the Planning Department to help out with the acquisition of this property and with the restoration of the floodplain on this property. So we've been working on this for the past 4 years, and we're now, as of last October, Vermont River Conservancy purchased the property from the Sosasimo Lumber Company, and we're now in the process of doing the final design and permitting for the project. So this is a site plan of the property. The Whetstone Brook is in blue here. This is the upstream end, it flows in this direction. The dark line here is the property boundary. It's about 12.2 acres. Majority of the property is on the south side of Whetstone Brook. There's a small portion of the parcel on the north side. Over the last 100 years, this property has been used for different kinds of lumber, wood products production. There's a sawmill on the site. It's known, I guess, locally as Sawdust Alley because of all of the different wood products industries that have gone on there. And over time, the natural floodplain of this area was filled with gravel to raise the elevation of the site so that it didn't flood during flood events, and it was useful for the wood products industry. And like I said, most recently, Sosasumo Industries used this as a storage yard for lumber that was part of their kiln drying operation down here. So the plan is to remove that imported fill and reduce the elevation of this property back close to its original floodplain elevation, so that when Whetstone Brook floods, which it does frequently, this area will absorb water, floodwaters. We're going to actually reduce the elevation between 4 and 8 feet, depending on where we are on the property. It's about 40,000 cubic yards of material that will be removed. And the end product will be a ecologically properly restored floodplain, and it'll also be a recreational area for the town. So kind of an open space recreation area. It won't have any structures like ball fields, that sort of thing, but really an open space for people to use passively. The plan right now is to have a small parking area at the upstream or downstream end of the property that would be off of Bird Street, like I think a 6-car parking area here, and then a trail that would kind of loop through the property that would be just a walking trail for folks. The plan is to also revegetate the property once it's regraded with vegetation that would be appropriate for a floodplain area. So we know what type of floodplain vegetation you would naturally find, and so we're going to try and work to revegetate it with that material. There's also a existing wetland area on this southern edge of the property, this green area here. That's a jurisdictional wetland. State controls the use of that, and that's going to be restored. It's been basically, there's a fair amount of kind of junk in there that will be removed, and it will continue to operate as a floodplain, as a wetland area. Kind of the third element is up at this upstream end. There's a purple area here on the map, and that's, we're going to propose building a small stormwater retention pond. There's a very steep stream that comes down from the upper end of the property here and basically comes right down the fall line and enters Whetstone Brook right here. And that carries a lot of street runoff and a lot of pollutants that are associated with that kind of urban runoff. And the idea is to redirect that through a sedimentation pond here so that when the water flows down into this area, it'll have a chance to slow down and sediment will drop out. And then redirect the flow from the sedimentation pond through this wetland complex for more attenuation of nutrients and sediment and that sort of thing. So the plant, it will result in a better water quality for Whetstone Brook. So those are basically the 4 elements: restore the floodplain, restore the wetland, create the stormwater mitigation system here, and create a passive recreation area. So that's kind of the overview of the project. Where we are right now is during the process of purchasing the property, we had what's called a phase 1 environmental assessment done to look for any hazardous materials. This type of site is prone to some kind of contamination because of its industrial background. So the phase 1 study did turn up a low level, at that point it was considered to be a low-level contaminant of what are called PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're a type of pollutant that you find in most urban areas. It's basically whenever there's any combustion going on, it's the sort of residue from that combustion. So it could be from diesel exhaust, from the trucks that were in here. It could be from, who knows historically what kind of burning went on this property. So the first assessment of that indicated that the PAH levels were above the urban limit. Subsequent to that, the state changed the rules on what the threshold levels were, and at this point, the PAH levels are below the urban level. So if the soils were left here on site, they would not cause any hazardous materials jurisdiction by the state. We, on the other hand, know that we're going to remove those soils and move them somewhere else. So if those soils are moved to another urban area, there will be no state oversight. But if the soils are moved to a non-urban area, then the state's going to take jurisdiction about what's called the receiving site will be. So we don't know at this point where the soils are going to go because that's part of the bidding process for doing this work. But we're prepared that if the soils are going to move to a non-urban location, it will go through the proper procedures with the Department of Environmental Conservation folks. We've received a EPA grant to clean up the contaminated soils, or the soils that were designated to be contaminated. There's of the 40,000 yards, about 10,000 are contaminated. And they're mostly at this end of the property. So we've received the EPA grant to do that work, and that's part of why we're here today, is beginning the permitting process to allow that work to go forward. We've also applied for a FEMA grant to remove the rest of the soils, and we just heard that this project was chosen as a top state project from the FEMA funding point of view to go now to the federal level for consideration. So we are cautiously optimistic that we will also receive money from FEMA to do the work.